hello everyone. Welcome to another live stream of the History of Life podcast. Today I'm joined by Dr. Nicholas Peter Lee Allen, and we're going to be discussing the origin of the Jewish God on Judaism. So that being said, Nicholas, thank you for joining me today.
Yeah, it's great being here. Thanks, Jacob. I think what I'll do is I'll start by putting on a PowerPoint, and then you can just hear me talking over it.
Sounds good. All right, I see it.
Great. Well, you might remember in earlier discussions we were talking about nascent.
Hide the little toolbox on the top there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, you're fine.
That's
All right.
Great. We were talking about the fact that there's more than one Judaism, and Judaism has evolved over a very, very long period of time. And up until now, we've done a lot of talking about what worship looked like in the Canaanite states. For example, we looked at the under the influence of Egypt. We were talking about a period of time from about, say, 1500 to about 1100. You've got a lot of Egyptian influences. And then we looked at some of the gods that were worshipped by the Canaanites, and we also looked at specific deities worshipped by the Judahites and the Israelites, like El and Asherah, etc. And we noticed that we were not really dealing with proper Judaism yet. We were dealing with a form of polytheism, which was turning into what we call monolatrism. That's where you have a lot of deities, but one or two of them are more important. And what seems to be the case is that during the building of the first temple, it's so-called Solomon's temple, which according to most people seems to have happened around about 1000 BCE, maybe a bit later. We know for a fact that that temple was not just a home, if you like, a spiritual home just for Yahweh. It was filled with other cult objects. And we know that because the Bible actually tells us that in 640, roughly, Josiah the king took out from the temple. This is before it was destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. He took out cult objects belonging to Asherah and cosmic deities and had them burnt, which tells us that they were monolatrists. In other words, Yahweh was very important. He was the most important deity, but they also paid lip service, if you like, to other lesser deities. So we're still not dealing with proper Judaism as it is today. And I like to use the word normative Judaism, and that's a difficult concept because what is normative since the religion is evolving, and it's not the only religion that's evolving. So what I'm doing at the moment is I'm looking at other possible influences that may have helped Judaism come to a point where it looked more like Judaism is practiced today. In other words, where you have one deity and you have this emphasis on righteousness, you have an emphasis on people behaving in an ethical way, an ethical monotheism, where there is a far more emphasis on the responsibility and accountability of individuals within that community to do the right thing, that they're not doing it because of some primitive requirement that they're going to escape hell or they're going to get a pat on the back when they die, but that they do the right thing because it is ethically the right thing to do. And that is one of the key cornerstones of what I would call more normative Judaism. But certainly, if we're going back to about 700, 750 BCE, there's no ways the Judahites and the Israelites, for that matter, were actually practicing that kind of Judaism. They were still in a monolatrist phase. So we leave it like that for now. We have discussed this in detail in other talks. I'm going to look very quickly at one of the world's oldest religions and try to show you how it may have had some influence, and that is Zoroastrianism. Now we know that it is based very heavily on Vedic culture, and just to let you know where that all started, I've got a map here of the Indus Valley civilization, which stretches right back to about 2600 BCE. So it's almost contemporary with the beginnings of the worship of El in the southern Levant, because we know that his worship goes back to about 2900 BCE. And there was civilizations starting up along the Indus River there, as you can see on the map. And when we get to about 1500 BCE, which is the same time as the beginning of the New Kingdom in Egypt, we see that the Vedic culture is now starting to spread across the northwest of India. And it goes on till about 500 BCE. And you can see there it's almost totally spread across the whole northern section of the subcontinent of India. Now, Vedism produced a number of texts, and in fact those texts are called Vedas. Probably the most famous one is the Rig Veda, and it discusses in there the deities that were worshipped by these people. And I'm just going to mention a few of them because they became ultimately part of Zoroastrianism. And another interesting thing is that Vedism led also to Hinduism. Hinduism and Zoroastrianism both grew out of the same source, if I can say that. So if you look at, these are typical artifacts dating from roughly about 2000 BCE up to about 500 BCE, the sort of things that they have found in archaeological digs. The deities that they had at that time, which you will recognize if you know anything about Hinduism, eventually became part of the Hindu culture. So, for example, we have a god called Dios, which is a sky god or a sky father. And because of Indo-European languages, you will know, of course, that the Greeks and the Romans named their sky god with a very similar name because it's a similar language. Dias becomes Deus, or God, and we also get Zeus from that, which is the name of the father of the gods for the Greeks. So you can see the link linguistically from Sanskrit right through to Latin, to Greek and Latin. Another deity that they started to worship was Indra. And she, in fact, has survived in her own right for later cultures. She was originally a demon, and eventually he was a demon, and then he became associated with thunder, lightning, and rain, and also something called the Soma, which I'll talk about just now. Soma is what can I call it? It's a drug that you take to give yourself hallucinations. And this is very common in a lot of primitive religions where, if you think for a moment of Dionysus, the worship of Dionysus, people would drink alcohol, wine, to become irrational so they could appreciate the deity, because they believed that the deity, to understand the deity, you had to enter into an irrational state. Agni, very, very important deity, which also survives into Zoroastrianism as well, which is a god of fire. And I'll talk a bit more about fire just now. Fire is terribly important to Zoroastrianism. It's and as it was to the Vedic cultures, it was associated with knowledge and transformation and purity. And what I can quickly tell you is that we know that around about, say, 1000 BCE onwards, that these cultures used to use fire to punish people who had committed offenses against society, even to the extent of pouring molten bronze onto the chest of the offender. The belief was that fire was perfectly pure. It was untainted with any wickedness, and the quickest way of getting somebody to a state of purity was basically to put fire to it. And for that reason, the sun was considered to be, if you like, the supreme source of purity, which I'll talk about just now. We also have Rudra, very important deity. What can I say about Rudra? He means to roar or cry, and he eventually evolved into Siva, who you might know if you are interested in Hinduism. Varuna, incredibly powerful deity. This is a cosmic deity, and in fact, some of us believe that Varuna evolved into Ahura Mazda. Ahura Mazda is the principal deity of Zoroastrianism, and it's possible that the concepts behind Varuna eventually manifested in Ahura Mazda. He's a majestic, all-seeing deity who's paired with another deity called Mitra, and you're going to hear lots about Mitra. Mitra is a covenantal deity, and in earlier times he used to fly around the world attached to the sun, because the sun was the symbol of absolute purity. And with his beady eyes, he would look at humans below him, and he would make sure that they were all behaving, which is quite amusing. Mitra and the other deities eventually became, when Zoroastrianism took off and they started to worship only one deity, very similar to what happened to the Judaic beliefs, the other deities were recast as, I'm using a Western term here, which is inaccurate, to say they were more like angels, if that makes sense. So in other words, they were demoted from being gods and goddesses and became angelic beings. Some of them became demons, and some of them became angelic beings, which in Zoroastrianism are called yazatas, and I'll talk about that just now. So you have a very similar setup. You have a polytheism that evolves into a monotheism. It's exactly the way Judaism evolved from its earlier sources. Some of the rituals that we know were practiced by the Veda culture and which still linger in modern Zoroastrianism. One of them is the Soma ritual, which I mentioned earlier. This is where you have a hallucinogenic drug which you drink. We're not sure what plants they use at that time. It could have been a form of ephedrine from the plant ephedra. There are many subspecies. I'll just put up one there for you to look at. And the other one is it may have come from the fly agara toadstool, which is extremely poisonous. The point is, in modern Zoroastrianism, they call this the Haoma ritual, which is related to Soma. And they take this liquid to make themselves feel stronger and healthier. And they use it, for example, if somebody's dying, they give it to them to try and bring them back to life. They give it to children to emphasize health and strength and vitality. So that's a very old custom that goes way back. The other one, of course, is fire, which I've just mentioned. Fire rituals are very common in modern Zoroastrianism, and they were very common in Vedic times. And if you know anything about Hinduism, you'll know that fires are still very, very important. They're used, again, because of their purifying nature. And in Vedic culture, the fire was seen almost to be the mouth, if I can say that, the mouth of the deity, because it consumed whatever you offered it. I remember in normative Judaism, they also used fire to destroy the animal parts that were designated only for Yahweh. Certain parts of the animal could not be eaten by humans, and they were turned to ash on the altar. A very similar concept, that the only way the deity can consume the meat, in the case of Judaism, is to actually burn it and turn it into ash. There are other rituals too, which I'm not going to go into. They had a lot of horse rituals. Fascinating culture. Right, now the founder of this religion we're pretty sure this man existed, which is unusual for most religions, because if you think of Buddhism, we're pretty sure there was a Buddha. With Judaism, we're not so sure about Moses. But in terms of Zoroastrianism, we believe there must have been somebody who fulfilled that role as the founder of that religion. The problem is we don't know when he lived. Some people will say he lived literally 6,000 years ago. It's more likely, though, that he lived probably about 1000 BCE, right up to maybe even 700 BCE. And all indications are that he was Persian. In other words, he lived in the Persian region, but we don't know exactly where. And as you can see by all the different names that he has, depending on the language, he has many epithets, but he's probably better known as Zoroaster in the Western world. More correctly, you should really refer to him as Zarathustra, which is Avestan. Avestan is a very ancient language, and it evolved indirectly from Sanskrit. Now, the story goes that he, aware of the polytheism in Iran or Persia at that time, was approached by the true God, Ahura Mazda, who told him that there was only one deity and that he must now start preaching this new religion. And Zarathustra had a very tough time trying to convert people. He eventually convinced a ruler, like a king, to take up this new religion, and it started to grow from that point. He ultimately was murdered. There are many different stories. One is that he was burnt alive in a fire temple, and that's actually very appropriate because Zoroastrians don't hold to having monuments to famous people because they don't want things to become idolatrous. And it's believed that Zarathustra, by leaving his words behind and his sacred teaching, that is a more fitting monument than if we had his body with some materialistic monument. So that sort of sums up, if you like, the attitude to it. Zoroastrians, for example, they may do it now, but they didn't in those times bury. They would cremate, or even leave the body to be consumed naturally by birds. There are many different ways that they did it, so that the person wouldn't actually lie in the earth. What is very fascinating is that we know that even before the Achaemenid Persian Empire, or the Achaemenid Persian Empire, Zoroastrianism had caught on in the Persian world. And by the time of the empire itself, this is the moment when the Persians defeated the Neo-Babylonians, and took over inter alia Judah itself. So they also took over Egypt. They took over the whole of Asia. Everything from Greece to Egypt to India in the east was under their command. And you might remember when we spoke about Alexander the Great, who managed to take over this empire in about 11 years, did so because they had already carved out an empire that stretched literally from the Mediterranean to India. You might also remember that the Persians were in battle with the Greeks for many years, and under the reign of people like Xerxes, attacks were made against the Greek homeland, and Athens was in fact destroyed by the Persians. And when Alexander the Great ultimately took over Persia and turned it into his own empire, it's possible that they just destroyed Persepolis as vengeance for what they'd done to Athens. And in the rebuilding of Athens, of course, then we have all those beautiful buildings that you all know about, like the Parthenon on top of the Acropolis. So the empire part of this period lasts for, you can see that, for just over 200 years, up until the time of Alexander the Great. And the kings, who were called Shah and Shahs, which means King of Kings, they were Zoroastrian. We know from inscriptions that they worshipped Ahura Mazda. And everything that they did, they praised Ahura Mazda. They praised him for their reign. They praised him for their accomplishments. We know that when the Parthian Empire came into being, which lasted for about 450 years, they also embraced Zoroastrianism. And then finally we have the Sassanid Empire, which lasted right up until the time of Islamic conquest. With the rise of Islam, unfortunately, Zoroastrianism was pushed down. A lot of their books were destroyed, and a lot of people fled. And that is why today many Zoroastrians actually live in India and not in Iran. So it had a good run. And the period that we're interested in is the 550 to 330, because that is the period when normative Judaism seems to have coalesced. Coincidentally, at the same time that they were under the rule of the Achaemenid Persians. Now, to really get a handle on Zoroastrianism, I just want to talk about a few theological concepts, and then I'd compare them to some Jewish concepts a little bit later. The first thing is that you must be aware of a quality called Asha. It's very difficult to explain Asha, except to say that it is a social order, but it's also considered to be a natural cosmic order. It's a divine order, and it relates to virtue, and I would even add righteousness. The concept of righteousness is in there. Some people have suggested that it talks about truth, but truth is not really the right word. It talks about a beneficial social order wherein all members of the religious community strive for harmony, prosperity, moral order, and justice. It's quite a concept. And it is, emphasis is on a person to achieve this by themselves in terms of their own, what's the word I'm looking for? By their own volition. They have to be accountable and responsible. The emphasis is on actions and thoughts, not on belief and faith. And that makes it almost identical to normative Judaism, because normative Judaism is principally interested in good works, not the belief stuff. Okay, so there are very big similarities there. In many ways, it's more pragmatic. Buddhism is also very pragmatic, and normative Judaism is very pragmatic. So there are similarities there. Then you have the opposite. Now, this is where there are differences between Zoroastrianism and normative Judaism. Judaism is a monistic monotheism because it doesn't have a concept of evil. In other words, a personification of evil. It doesn't have a devil who tries to convince people not to be good. If you don't want to be good in Judaism, that's on you. It's your responsibility. But in Zoroastrianism, although the emphasis is on personal behavior and personal responsibility, they do believe in the existence of evil. So it's a dualistic religion, like Christianity and Islam. And they call this dishonorable behavior, this immoral behavior, and lies and deception as druj. And somebody who practices deceit is called a drugvant. And it's an abomination in their culture. So everybody aspires to be part of Asha and to ensure that the community has a beneficial social order. Those who oppose that are considered to be part of the druj, the lie. Zoroastrians believe in a soul that's immortal, called the Urvan. They also have other concepts like Frashavi, which means technically an immortal soul that predates creation almost. And in other words, if you are a Zoroastrian, you have already existed before you came into this world. And then while you're in this world, you are subject to the Asha, Druj, dualism, and on death you are then evaluated according to your works and your thoughts, which I'll talk about just now a little bit more. Another interesting thing is that Zoroastrianism believes in, it has an eschatological framework where it believes in an ending, a finality to the world, a restoration of the world. I'll talk more about this when I talk about Ahura Mazda, but the belief that you have this perfect world being made by Ahura Mazda, and then the evil one, Angra Mainyu, is constantly destroying it. He's unpicking, he's undoing all the good that's being done. But at the end of time, there will be a Frasho Kareti, which is a restoration of the world. A time when finally Asha succeeds and Druj is finally defeated. It's a very similar concept to the Jewish Tikkun Olam, restoring the world. Okay, now Ahura Mazda means, translated, Lord of Wisdom or Wise Lord. Ahura Mazda is considered to be ineffable. He is the source of everything. He is the creator. He is omnipotent. He's also omni-noetic. He knows everything. He's omni-theological. Everything that comes into being was caused by his thinking, by his will. And he is perfect and all goodness. He's omnibenevolent in all aspects. He works together with 6 holy, bounteous immortals, And I don't like using Western terminology because it's misleading, but let's call them archangels. That's the nearest word I can think of. The archangels, Amesha spans is what they're called in Avestan, the original language. And the Amesha spans are the holy immortals who form a body called the Amesha Spenta. The Amesha Spenta is a collective of these 6 immortals, and in some texts it's just the 6, and in other texts it includes Ahura Mazda as the 7. So you have a holy number here, 7, a septad. The Amesha spans means immortal holy ones. That is what the Amesha Spenta is made up of, the bounteous immortals. And then Ahura Mazda is given the title Spenta Mainu while he's part of this Amesha Spenta. That means the bounteous spirit. I've done a diagram to kind of illustrate what's happening here. So here we're dealing with the 7, and these archangel type beings with the divinity himself form a unity, if you like. And the faces and the descriptions of each one of these holy immortals is identical. They are identical in appearance, but they each have a particular task to do while they are part of this structure. Ahura Mazda is viewed as the creator or source of the other 6 Amesha spans or archangels, and they are often described as emanations of him. So Ahura Mazda is not merely one among 6 divine entities. He is the central essence from which all the other Amesha spans proceed. So Ahura Mazda unifies these 6 into a coherent, harmonious structure, and it's a composite of their virtues. They all function as their architect. He functions as their architect and sustainer, and he binds them together in spiritual and cosmic order. Now, if you look at each one of these archangel Amesha spans individually, you can see that they each have their own little dominion. So, and just briefly, Spenta Amaiti and Havatat and Emeritat, they are female. And Vohumana, Asha Vahishta, and Kshatra Vairiya are neutral. They're neuter. There's no male in this setup. Only Ahura Mazda is masculine. So he is the Spenta Mainu, Lord Wisdom, Supreme Wisdom, Source of Being, and he generates the other 6. And then you've got Vohumana, who means good intention, good thought, and he's responsible for creation and animals. And then Asha Vahishta is concerned with righteousness, and obviously that means she's concerned with Asha, that concept I spoke about, and also fire, because both of those speak to purity, truth. Then you have Kshatra Vairiya, who means desirable dominion or kingdom, and he's responsible for good thoughts and metal. And then you have Spenta Amaita, who means holy devotion and obedience. And her responsibilities are harmony, devotion, fertility, the earth, and also the underworld. And then the last 2, Havatat and Emeritat, they are actually, I almost want to say twins. They work together as a duet. And together, they're responsible for health, wholeness, life, and also the afterlife, immortality and eternity. And that's why they're responsible for things like water, because water is obviously linked to life. Okay, so now you've got this amazing concept of Ahura Mazda surrounded by these magnificent beings, and one immediately thinks of Enoch, the book of Enoch, where he speaks of Yahweh being accompanied by 7 holy angels, which I'll talk about again just now. The idea that the Godhead is somewhat supported by these angelic beings. And the thing is, when you start talking about angelic beings, you're moving away from a pure monotheistic concept, because normative Judaism has no place for angels. Actually, there's only Yahweh, there's only God. But over time, the idea of angels has come back into prominence, and they are seen, if you like, as not only assistants to his divine need, but they're also there to constantly praise him and to emanate from him, from his, radiate from his perfection. So in a sense, it's a very similar concept to what we're seeing in Mithraism. But then I mentioned that all the deities that originally were part of the polytheistic setup were demoted. And in Zoroastrianism, they have hundreds of these angelic beings called Jazatas. And what I've put here for you to see is just 18 of them, 17 of which are quite senior ones. They're not as important as the Amesha spans that I showed you just now, but they all play a vital role in the rituals, in the theology, and in the liturgy. And you'll notice that Mithra, who was a god in his own right at one time, is there. He's now a Yazata, a very important Yazata. And there are other ones there also. Anahita, for example, she was a deity in her own right. You've got Sraosha, also very important. Rashnu. Yima is related to one of the first humans. Aban is responsible for water. Riyaman is the friend. Attar is responsible for fire. And they all have different roles. So I've given you the, shall we say, the positive side, the Asha side of the Zoroastrian. Now let's look at the Druj side. You have almost a twin of Ahura Mazda in the setup called Angra Mainyu. And again, depending on which text you read and which period in history, some texts talk about Ahura Mazda being the creator, and then Angra Mainyu and Spenta Mainyu being the two poles of that creation, the positive and the negative. But there's also a heterodox, that's come out of Zoroastrianism, what we call Zervanism, where they imagined that eternal time was the creator, and time had no beginning and no end, and it produced twins. One was Angra Mainyu and one was Ahura Mazda, and they are absolutely equal to each other, one being positive and one negative. So depending on which flavor you read, I would say most Zoroastrians today would say that Ahura Mazda is the stronger of the two, and they would probably go with the interpretation that Ahura Mazda is the creator. Zervanists would say that Angra Mainyu and Ahura Mazda are twins. Angra Mainyu is the lord of the demons. He is the embodiment of the lie. Very interesting. There's a story about him which is so similar to the Eden story that I must repeat it here. He apparently put it to the first woman and the first man that he had been lied to by Ahura Mazda, and that he had been deceived. And the man then fell with his pride. Very similar to the story of the evil one in Christianity, who first of all lies to the woman and tells her that if she eats of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, she will know everything, and that's why God doesn't want her to eat from it. And also the story that he fell because of his pride. So they're very similar concepts in the creation myths of these two religions. Angra Mainyu is an embodiment of evil and darkness. He's an embodiment of pure chaos. He's destructive. And if you read Middle Persian texts from the 9th to the 12th centuries of the Common Era, when they write down Ahura Mazda's name, Angra Mainyu's name, they write it upside down because they want to indicate the degree of disdain and loathing that they have for this demon. Now, he has a whole bunch of Daivas underneath him. They're also angelic. And as you can see from the name, it descends from the old Sanskrit name for a god. A Deva is a god. But what's happened in Zoroastrianism, they've turned them into the old gods, indicating that they used to be gods and we no longer worship them. And so although some of the old gods had become Yazatas and good, these ones are the ones that are not good. And they didn't become evil because Angra Mainyu made them evil. They became evil because they chose to be evil. Again, emphasizing that Zoroastrianism is interested in the accountability of the individual. In other words, you've got no excuse for doing the wrong thing. You choose to do the wrong thing. So these Daivas have chosen to be evil, and they serve Angra Mainyu. The other group that would serve Angra Mainyu would be human beings who want to be immoral. And so in a Zoroastrian world, you have these two sides. You have those seeking Asha and righteousness and harmony and social order and cosmic order. And then on the other side, you would have people who seek to tear down, to destroy, to be immoral, to lie and be deceitful. Those are the two sides. The Daivas became evil because of their evil thinking. So the emphasis is, again, Achemana means they chose to be evil. They weren't made evil, they became evil. Now, there's a very interesting relief sculpture in Persepolis, which shows Darius the king stabbing a lion. And if I sort of just brush it up a little bit, that idea sums up, if you like, Zoroastrianism. You've got this Ahura Mazda symbol of light, reason, rationality, struggling with irrationality and chaos. So it's a dualistic, eternal battle, if you like. That idea is prevalent also in Neo-Assyrian art as well, and don't forget the Neo-Assyrians came before the Achaemenid Persians, and the Achaemenid Persians also had previous kings before the empire who were also Zoroastrian. And there are lots of links here between the septad of divine beings that we see in Zoroastrianism and a septad of divine beings that we see in Neo-Assyrian art as well, which is maybe a topic for another time. I don't want to spend too much time on this, but each one of the Emesha Spenta, the archangel beings, is also in opposition to an archdemon. I'm not going to waste time on that. Basically, it's the flip side of whatever you're doing. So if you have a good mind, like Vahumana, then you're going to be fighting against Akamanu, who's an evil mind. Asha Vahishta is worried about righteousness and truth. Indra, as you remember Indra, she was a god from the Vedic times. She's a demon of apostasy, disorder, and opposition to truth. Some other interesting things to take note of. The Zoroastrians put a lot of stock into symbolic numbers, exactly like Judaism. For example, the number 3 dominates Zoroastrian faith. There are triplets and trinities. When they do blood sacrifices in the old days, they don't do them anymore, but in the old days they used to do blood sacrifices. A number of offers, a number of prayers, a number of rituals, a number of rites. Also the number of messianic saviors that they have, they're always in 3s. And it's also central to their concept of the good religion, which they practice, which is good thoughts, good words, and good deeds. Notice it's on action. All of that is on action, not faith. The number 4 is very important to them as well. The sacred elements, fire, water, air, and air, the 4 corners of the world. In most primitive cultures from ancient Near East, 4 is a symbol of unity and wholeness. The number 7, obviously very, very important. The fact that they have 7 divine members of the Godhead. The number 12 is important. They believe that there are 12,000 years of history that we have to live through before the end of time. 30 is a very important number because on their calendar, every month is 30 days. They also have a place for 33 divine beings. So 33 is also a very important number. That's 26 senior Yazatas plus the 6 Emesha Spens from the Emesha Spenta that I mentioned. I mentioned the eschatology aspect, okay, the end times, and also what happens to you after you die. They believe in an afterlife. And this is quite interesting. They believe that there's a place that is heaven called Garod Man. And they also believe in a hell. And at the end of time, you will be taken by a number of Yazatas, and you will have your Irvan weighed on a scale. And unlike other religions where if you are even slightly bad, then you go to hell, and you have to be completely good to go to heaven. In Zoroastrianism, as long as the scales tip in favor of Asha, then you go to heaven. If they tip slightly in favor of Druj, then you go to hell. And this is quite an interesting concept. When you get dragged down to hell, a hag will come out of the pit and drag you down. And she will be as ugly as you are sinful. So if you're very, very bad, then you'll have a very ugly hag. And if you're not so bad, you will have a relatively nice-looking hag, which I find quite amusing because you're still going to hell, but you will get your hag. And the hag will say to you as she drags you to hell, I am thy own deeds, O youth of evil words, of evil thoughts, of evil deeds, of evil religion. Okay? Salvation is in your own hands. So again, I'm just going to emphasize that you are responsible and accountable. That nobody's going to save you. However, they do have messianic concepts, which is really interesting. This is literally millennia before these ideas came into Christianity, for example. There are two versions, or two major versions of this, depending on which text you read. The older version talks of there being a Sashwant, a savior, who will be the son of Zarathustra. Apparently, there's a lake. The lake is called Lake Kayansi, and the semen of Zarathustra is in this lake. And a virgin will bathe in the water and give birth to a savior. So there we've got a virgin birth concept, thousands of years before it was thought of in more modern iterations. Later, that myth slightly changed to there being 99,999 righteous souls who guard Lake Kayanisa, to guard the semen of Ahura Mazda. And in the last 3,000 years of existence, each 1,000 years, a virgin will bathe and give birth to a son. There will be 3 of these saviors, one for each period, one at the beginning of each 1,000 years. And then at the end of that, the end of time will come and there will be a judgment. And then they have a concept of resurrection. It's understood that when they have separated out those who are part of Asher from those who are part of Druj, the ones who are part of Asher will be given new bodies in the afterlife. A brand new corporeal body. So it's a very physical resurrection. It's not a spiritual resurrection. And in a hurry there, end of days, they believe that the mountains, all the metal in the mountains will melt and pour across the face of the earth, and all of those who are morally upright will feel that they're being bathed in warm milk, but those who are evil will feel scorching pain as their flesh is burnt, and the fire will flow into hell and destroy Angra Mainyu and all his demons. That's the end. So you can see already that there are a lot of concepts in there which linger on in modern religions, which is very interesting. So with that little bit of background, let's get back to the Achaemenid Persians. They've been around as a family, the Achaemenids, from about 688 BCE. And possibly their most famous member is Cyrus the Great. And he's important because he's the man who defeated the Neo-Babylonians, and he allowed the Judahites to return from exile in Babylonia and go back to Jerusalem and Judah. From 559 right up to 330, which is the time of Darius III, all of those rulers that you see there, from Cyrus II to Darius III, were in charge of Judah. And it was a relatively peaceful time for the Judahites. And this is the very period when normative Judaism seems to have found its footing. The problem is knowing exactly when it found its footing. And the fact that Zoroastrianism was so prevalent at this time, it's rather hard to believe that there was no influence on Judaism whatsoever. And some people maintain that. I think the jury's still out on that issue. Some people feel that there's no smoking gun. Others would prefer that Judaism is its own, has its own evolution and didn't need outside influence. But I think that's also very naive if you consider that they had 350 odd years of domination by Egyptians. Then they had another 300 odd years of domination by Neo-Assyrians, even to the point where their language was changed. Then they had a good 50, 60 years of domination by the Neo-Babylonians, 300 years by the Persians, and they're about to have another 200 years of Seleucid rule. It's very hard to imagine that the people living in the southern Levant were completely untouched by such influence. Okay, I'm not going to worry about these. Are the names of the rulers. And this is the famous Behistun inscription in Iran, a massive inscription in 3 languages, which shows Darius worshipping in front, or paying homage to the Faravaha, which is a symbol of Zoroastrianism. That is not meant to be Ahura Mazda. That is simply a symbol of pointing the way to righteous living. And you'll see that the wings are made up of 3 sections, which represents the idea of good thoughts, good deeds. Okay, here we go. So that is the Faravaha symbol, which is, you'll see in a lot of inscriptions from ancient Persia and Iran. And today that is the symbol of Zoroastrianism. The symbolic man is holding a ring which symbolizes, what would you call that? Keeping faith to oaths, because that's very important. And Mithra, the Yazata in charge of that, makes sure that people don't make false commitments, that you stick to your word. You'll notice that the wings are divided up into 3, for the 3 aspects of Zoroastrianism. This is just to remind you of a previous talk about all the deities that the Canaanites had, including the Israelites and the Judahites. And this is what came, literally, this was still in existence up to about 100 years before the Babylonian captivity. And this is where I have a problem, trying to find out, when did normative Judaism really find its feet? When did it really start? For example, just to remind you, in 721 BCE, the kingdom of Israel was destroyed by the Neo-Assyrians. And Hezekiah, who was the king of the Judahites at that time, became a vassal king to the Neo-Assyrians. And you can see here that he is using Phoenician script to express this Aramaic/Hebrew that he's using here. His symbolism is still Egyptian. He worships Yahweh probably as the most important deity in the pantheon. And you can see that Yahweh is being portrayed here as a winged solar disk, which is a far cry from the way Yahweh is going to be viewed, say, by 350 BCE, when the Torah has been written and when the books of the Bible are starting to be put together. And that we have there, of course, the influence of the priests, the Judahite priests, who we know for a fact redacted a lot of the stories and a lot of the books and a lot of the lessons to push the agenda that the reason why Israel was destroyed was because the kings had committed idolatry, and to warn people that they had to stay pure to Yahweh, they had to obey the purity laws, and they had to worship Yahweh alone. But the point is, to worship Yahweh alone is a later phase. And if we know that by 350 to 300 BCE, we have normative Judaism, and everything that we've been told about the past has been redacted, it's very difficult to know exactly when we move from monolatrism to proper ethical monotheism. But what we do know is that period that it happened was exactly coincidental with the occupation of the Persian dynasties. So if you look at this tree here of all the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah, you can see that the kings of Israel stop at 721 because their kingdom has been destroyed. Judah continues, but only as a vassal kingdom to the Neo-Assyrians. And this is where, if you like, the story becomes interesting. If you look at occupied Judah, we've got the Neo-Assyrians who are, they've already destroyed Israel and they're now occupying Judah. And around about 620 to 617, around about there, we know that they are defeated by the Neo-Babylonians. The Neo-Babylonians started under a guy called Nabopolassar, and then his successor was Nebuchadnezzar II. As you know the story, Nebuchadnezzar II was shunned by one of the early kings of Judah. If I remember correctly, it was about 601, a guy called Jehoiakim snubbed Nebuchadnezzar II. So Nebuchadnezzar came into Jerusalem around about 598 BCE and killed Jehoiakim. And then he put a guy called Jeconiah on the throne, and then he exiled him to Babylonia. And then he installed a guy called Zedekiah on the throne in about 597 to 587. And then Zedekiah rebelled against Nebuchadnezzar II. And of course, that really upset Nebuchadnezzar II. And he came in then, laid siege to Jerusalem. He killed Zedekiah's sons before him. And then he put his eyes out. And he then destroyed the walls of Jerusalem, and he then destroyed Solomon's temple. So the temple was destroyed. He then sends elite Judahites into exile. And I must emphasize, these Judahites that went into exile were not slaves. They were exiled because they had the capacity to manage. They could be used to be administrators in the Babylonian Empire. The unskilled Judahites were left behind to till the fields. In only a few years, 42 to 50 years, depending on which group of exiles we're talking about, the Judahites return because Cyrus II of Persia has now defeated the Neo-Babylonians. We have an Achaemenian Persian king now, a Shah in charge of Judah. He's allowing the Judahites to return to Jerusalem and Judah. He also gives them permission to rebuild their temple. So this is all good news for the Judahites. And if you read the Bible, which has been redacted by the priests and their holiness code, they will tell you that the Judahites who were exiled included priests. They already had their purity laws. They were already practicing normative Judaism. And when they came back, those that could prove their ancestry were allowed to once again take up their roles in the community as normative Jews. The problem with this interpretation is that if you look at this timeline, in 640 BCE, Josiah had just chucked out the cult objects belonging to Asherah and the cosmic deities from the first temple. So in other words, not everybody could possibly be a practicing normative Jew at this time. And the possibility exists that the stories that were told from the priests, say living between 400 and 350, have been changed so that they have retrospectively claimed that Judaism was already normative as early as 600. The facts are we don't really know for sure. When you read the book of Ezra and Nehemiah, we get another story, which is even more strange. We know that due to political intrigue, we had to wait to 515 BCE before the second temple was completed. Nehemiah is still trying to convert people to worship Yahweh alone around about 450 BCE. That is also very strange. Ezra and Nehemiah were working within 10 years of each other, and they both seem to have been very concerned with bringing people to accept Yahweh as the sole deity. In other words, Yahweh alonists. And if we take those texts literally, then it would seem that a form of normative Judaism was starting to coalesce around about, say, 470 to 450 BCE, sometime after the temple had been rebuilt. So the one thing that I also find very interesting, and I'm just going to read you something. Nehemiah, who's one of the important, he's not a prophet, but you can say he's a sage. One of the books in the Bible is written by him. He tells us in no uncertain terms that he was in the service of Artaxerxes. Artaxerxes tells him that he is allowed to go and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. He starts off by telling us, if you read Nehemiah chapter 1, verse 11, he says something very interesting. He says, I was cupbearer to the king. And then in Nehemiah 2, he says, in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, that means 450 BCE, exactly, when wine was brought for him, I took the wine and gave it to the king. I had not been sad in his presence before, so the king asked me, why does your face look so sad when you are not ill? This can be nothing but sadness of heart. And then he goes on to explain to the king that he's sad because the city of Jerusalem is in a very bad state, and he wants to fix it, and he wants to fix the gates in the wall leading to the temple. And then the king says to him, you can go. He gives him a letter. He also sends him with army officers and cavalry to protect him. Pay for this stuff. It's interesting to me that Nehemiah says that he was the cupbearer to the king. The king is a Zoroastrian. They have purity laws exactly like the Jews do. There is no way that Nehemiah could be the cupbearer to the king if he himself was not a Zoroastrian. He would have had to have complied 100% to the purity laws of Zoroastrianism to be able to pick up that cup and give it to the king. So here we have a direct link between Zoroastrianism and Judaism. We have Nehemiah going out from the presence of the king to convert people, to make sure that they understand that the God of Jerusalem is the God of heaven, that he is a true deity. And he's telling us that the Zoroastrians are quite happy about this and actually support him. That I find very interesting. Because the information, of course, we don't know if it's been redacted. We don't know if somebody has interpolated. We only have the text that's in front of us. The other thing that's very interesting is if you read the book of Enoch, which was written a little bit later, this I'm guessing about 250 onwards, the book of Enoch speaks of the 7 holy angels, which modern Christians often refer to as archangels, but they're referred to as holy angels in the Bible. We're told their names. We have Uriel, Raphael, Raguel, Michael, Sariel, Gabriel, Remiel. Notice they're all theophoric names. They all have something to do with God. El is a title of Yahweh. El, God. So we have Uriel, the angel of wisdom. Raphael, who's the healer. Raguel, okay, who looks after basically the celestial beings, as they were called. Michael, which means who is like God, presides over human virtue and national affairs. Sariel, he oversees the spirits of those who sin in the spirit. Gabriel, the strong man of God, or the strength of God, he rules over paradise, serpents, and the cherubim, who are other angels. And of course, later in the New Testament, he is portrayed as the if you like, the messenger of God. But in older versions, he was the herald of divine messages. And then Remiel is responsible for judgment and resurrection of the righteous. As an experiment, and this is purely speculative, I thought, what would happen if you lined up the holy angels with the 7 Ameshpens and a Mesespenta of the Zoroastrian system? And in many cases, you can find very interesting correspondences. Of particular interest is Raphael, who's responsible as the guardian of creation and healing of the earth. He can be linked almost directly with Spenta Amaiti, sorry. We have the interest in immortality and eternal life, almost exactly mirrors Remiel's job for eternal life and resurrection. Ahura Mazda himself, as the deity, is obviously the wise Lord and Creator, and Yahweh is not in this particular context, But if we look at Sarakel or Sariel, this archangel is the guardian of divine mysteries, the ultimate judge under Yahweh's authority. So in other words, he carries the authority of Yahweh directly. And you can go on with some of the other correspondences, which are rather interesting. So let me leave it there. Just want to stop the screen sharing.
Yeah, we have a super chat from Lloyd
What I'm trying
Rogers.
to say is that it's highly speculative, but what's interesting is that this is the period when you have an overlap between the two religions. The one is finding its feet and the other one is already mature. And out of it comes a religion which is very much emphasis is on righteousness. Judaism emphasizes the accountability, responsibility, the social order, very similar concepts. And one then wonders, was there probably a more direct link between the religion of the, well, I wouldn't call them oppressors in that same sense as Neo-Assyrians, but there were certainly the occupiers. And they did give the Judahites breathing room, without which they never would have got their religion together again, with obviously the restoration of the temple, etc. So I think it's food for thought. It's just interesting.
We have a super chat from Wade Rogers. Thank you for your super chat. Is it possible that the author of Matthew included the visit of the Magi bring gifts to Jesus as a way to say that Persians who freed the Jews were now subjected to the newborn king of the Jews?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that the writers of the Gospels would have deliberately looked for any link to give authority to what they're saying. Remember that the writers of the Gospels were using the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible, and they were basically scouring it, looking for things they could use to give authority to what they were saying in the New Testament. So it doesn't take what's the word I'm looking for? It's not rocket science. It's pretty obvious they would have done that, and it's interesting. The questioners mentioned the Magi. That is, in fact, what the Magi were. In fact, the priests of Zoroastrianism. A magus is the name they give to a priest, and the plural is Magi. And they were considered, well, they still are considered very learned, very wise people with the community. So it makes sense that they would have used those terms for the nativity story.
Do you think that the story of Ezra being commissioned by the Persian king Artaxerxes to bring out a copy of the law, even if that story isn't as historical as it presents itself, even if it didn't quite happen the way it said it happened, is it sort of admitting in its own way that, okay, we know about Persian influence, this is a reflection of it?
Well, what I can tell you is that it's normally accepted in some circles that Ezra was the person who started to introduce purity laws into Judaism. Now, if that is totally true, that's also another interesting point, isn't it? Because he comes directly from the source of a religion that has purity laws, and then he starts to introduce his own. I'm not saying that Judaism is a crib of Zoroastrianism. I must be very careful there. It's got its own roots, obviously, very, very deep roots. But I think I see here a modification. As we're moving away from a religion where you're burning animals to appease a deity who could smite you, like a warrior deity or a thunder deity or a fertility deity, to the concept that you have a benevolent deity who wants you to behave in a morally upright way. There's definitely a little difference there, if you like, if you know what I mean. You're moving away from a primitive concept of appeasing a deity to one where you are your sacrifice, if you like, in life, not just to kill animals, but is to sacrifice the way you live, to live a better life, to be a better person, to be a more respectful person. And it's also interesting, this was a time when Judaism evolves from being a national religion to a universal religion. Remember, the people who went off to Babylonia, and also people before that, they believed that they couldn't pray to Yahweh anymore because they're not in Judah or Israel. And there was definitely a change in a philosophical outlook at this time. Some of us believe that may be the influence of somebody like Jeremiah, because he's considered to be the second most important prophet, and he's also couched as being the person responsible for trying to get people to come back to Jerusalem after the captivity period, which is another interesting factor, that many of the Judahites didn't want to come back to Jerusalem after the captivity because they were happier being in Babylonia. I mean, why would you want to go back to a semi-desert when you're living in a nice, lush place and you've already spent 50 odd years there, your families are growing up there, you don't really want to move back to Jerusalem. So there's a suggestion that the Exodus story was actually invented about this time to encourage people to feel that the land belonged to them because God had given it to them, and that they were once slaves in Egypt and now they're coming back to their homeland that God had given them. So the Exodus story, it's believed, became dominant after this point for that very reason, to encourage people to come back. People came back with a different understanding of how to worship their God, that he could be worshipped anywhere. And there's a direct link between that and Zoroastrianism, because when Zoroastrianism started off, it was a national religion of the Persians or the Iranians. And then eventually it moved from, as I say, polytheism to monotheism, or albeit dualistic. And then it became became a universal deity that could be worshipped anywhere in the world. It's almost the same story. You've got a people, a genetic, a common identity, if you like, and they evolve their deity to the point where it's a national deity, and then it becomes bigger than that. The same thing happens with the Iranians. They develop their deity, and eventually it becomes bigger than them. Both deities require diets, require purity laws. Both require priests to protect the integrity of their texts, and also both societies were allowed to read sacred literature, but the priest had to interpret it for them. Very similar structures across the board. And there are just too many of these coincidences to say there's no influence. That's all I'm saying. I'm just saying there must be some overlap.
That's why I think the story makes sense about what it says about Ezra. And I'm not on the skeptical side of it. Some deny the historicity of the story, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's kind of a weird thing to make up, to admit that a major individual like Ezra was working with the Persians like that.
Well, so was Nehemiah. So I mean, they're both pivotal to what happened thereafter. They're pivotal to the formation of what I'm now calling normative Judaism. Whatever that word means, because, as I say, the trouble is the religion's evolving all the time. You can't really say there's one Judaisms. The same as Christianity. It evolves. Nothing is static. I mean, the Judaism of today, which is rabbinic Judaism, as you know, that's common era Judaism, which grew out of Pharisaic Judaism. If you were to go to Second Temple times, I don't think a modern Jew would even recognize. Well, they certainly wouldn't recognize what people are doing today as being Judaism.
So I think we'll close there. And I just remind everybody real quick that I have the links to Nicholas Peter. That being said, Nicholas, thank you for joining me today.
It's been